The ornate grandfather clock in the corner of Whitmore & Associates' conference room chimed 3 o'clock as the last of the condolences and congratulations were exchanged. The mahogany table that had witnessed countless family crises over the decades now bore the scattered remains of my grandfather's will. Empty coffee cups, crumpled tissues, and the satisfied expressions of relatives who had just received exactly what they'd expected from old Theodore Ashford's estate. I remained seated in my corner chair, the one closest to the door that I had unconsciously chosen for its escape potential. The familiar weight of disappointment pressed against my chest, though I'd learned long ago to show nothing on my face. Around me, the Ashford family hierarchy had been confirmed in legal documents. Uncle Charles securing the family estate and business holdings, Aunt Vivian inheriting the art collection and European properties, my cousins dividing trust funds that would secure their comfortable futures. And me? Nothing. Not even a token bequest to acknowledge my existence. Well, Aunt Vivian declared with the crisp satisfaction of someone whose expectations had been precisely met. Theodore certainly knew how to reward family loyalty. Her pointed glance in my direction carried decades of accumulated judgment. The disappointment of having a niece who had chosen social work over society functions, community organizing over country club memberships. My cousins Richard and Margaret were already discussing their plans for the trust funds, their voices carrying across the room with the casual entitlement of people who had never questioned their place in the family fortune. Uncle Charles stood at the window, his reflection in the rain-streaked glass suggesting contemplation of the vast responsibilities he had just inherited, along with the wealth. Mr. Whitmore, the elderly family attorney whose silver hair and formal manner had presided over Ashford affairs for 4 decades, began gathering his papers with the satisfied efficiency of someone whose work was complete. "I believe that concludes our business here," he announced, his voice carrying the finality of legal proceedings properly executed. "Indeed it does," Uncle Charles agreed, turning from the window with the authoritative bearing he had inherited along with everything else. "Theodore's wishes have been honored, and we can all move forward with clarity about our respective positions." The dismissal was polite but absolute. Time for the family gathering to disperse, for the acknowledged heirs to begin their new lives of enhanced privilege, for me to return to my modest apartment and teaching position at the community center, confirmed once again in my role as the family's disappointing footnote. As chairs scraped back and coats were retrieved from the elegant brass stand, I prepared for my familiar exit, quietly, quickly, without causing any disruption to the satisfaction radiating from those who mattered in the Ashford family narrative. That's when the conference room door opened, and everything changed. The man who entered the conference room was younger than Mr. Whitmore by at least 20 years, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that spoke of expensive tailoring and professional success. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his sharp brown eyes surveyed the assembled family with the calculating assessment of someone accustomed to reading power dynamics quickly and accurately. "I apologize for the interruption," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't immediately place, perhaps continental European, refined through years of international business. "I am Alessandro Benedetti, representing the Rome office of Benedetti and Partners." Uncle Charles straightened, his earlier satisfaction giving way to confused alertness. "I'm not familiar with your firm, Mr. Benedetti. What possible business could you have with the Ashford family at this particular moment?" Alessandro smiled, an expression that managed to be both professionally courteous and mysteriously knowing. "I represent certain interests of the late Theodore Ashford that were maintained separately from his primary estate and British legal arrangements." He paused, allowing this information to settle over the room like an unexpected storm cloud. "Specifically, I am here to execute provisions of a second will." The words hung in the suddenly still air. A second will? The very concept seemed impossible. Mr. Whitmore had been managing grandfather's affairs for decades, had assured us that all legal matters were straightforward and properly documented. "That's preposterous," Aunt Vivian declared, her voice sharp with indignation. "Theodore's will was executed according to proper procedures. There cannot be a second will." Alessandro reached into his leather briefcase and withdrew a document that even from across the room appeared substantial. Multiple pages bound in blue legal backing with official seals and ribbons. "The will I represent was executed in Switzerland 18 months ago, according to international estate planning protocols that supersede certain British provisions." Mr. Whitmore had gone pale, his usual professional composure abandoning him as he stared at the document. "This is highly irregular. International wills require specific notification procedures, which were followed precisely," Alessandro interrupted smoothly. "Your firm was notified according to Swiss legal requirements. though the notification was delivered to a different partner who apparently failed to communicate the information appropriately. He withdrew a certified letter from his briefcase, showing the return receipt that confirmed delivery to Whitmore and Associates 8 months earlier. The elderly attorney's face grew even more ashen as he examined the documentation that should have alerted him to complications in what he had assumed was a straightforward estate matter. The Swiss will address his assets and arrangements not covered by the British estate documents, Alessandro continued, his tone becoming more formal as he assumed the role of legal executor. Assets that Theodore Ashford maintained privately for specific purposes he did not wish disclosed during his lifetime. My family was exchanging increasingly desperate glances, their recently confirmed inheritances suddenly feeling less secure as the possibility of unknown assets and alternative arrangements emerged. Uncle Charles had assumed the protective stance he adopted during business crises, positioning himself between the family and this unexpected threat to their newly acquired wealth. "What assets are you referring to?" he demanded, his authority challenged by circumstances beyond his control or understanding. Alessandro's smile returned, warmer now and directed not at Uncle Charles, but at me specifically. Mr. Ashford's Swiss holdings include significant real estate investments across Europe, a diversified portfolio of international securities, and controlling interests in several technology companies developing innovations he believed would transform multiple industries. The room had gone completely silent, except for the persistent drumming of rain against the windows. The implications of what Alessandro was describing, assets potentially worth more than everything that had just been distributed through the British will, created a stunned realization that the family's understanding of grandfather's wealth had been completely inadequate. "These assets," Alessandro continued, his gaze remaining fixed on me with increasing intensity, along with the instructions for their use and the philosophical framework Theodore developed for their management, have been bequeathed in their entirety to his granddaughter Isabella Marie Ashford. Isabella. Not Isabel, as I had been called throughout my life, but the formal version of my name that appeared on official documents, and that only grandfather had ever used during our private conversations about history, literature, and social responsibility. The silence that followed Alessandro's announcement was deafening. Uncle Charles gripped the back of his chair so tightly his knuckles went white. Aunt Vivian's mouth had fallen open in undisguised shock. My cousins stared at me as if I had suddenly transformed into an entirely different species. I felt the blood drain from my face as the magnitude of what had just been revealed began to register. The grandfather who had seemed to leave me nothing had actually left me everything. Everything that truly mattered to him. Everything he had built beyond the knowledge of the family that had taken his conventional wealth for granted. "There must be some mistake," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the charged atmosphere of the conference room. Alessandro's expression softened slightly, his professional demeanor giving way to something more personal. "No mistake, Miss Ashford. Your grandfather was quite explicit about his intentions. He believed you alone possessed the vision and integrity necessary to continue the work he had begun, work that the rest of the family was neither aware of nor prepared to understand." The chaos that erupted following Alessandro's revelation was immediate and visceral. Uncle Charles began shouting about fraud and legal challenges, while Aunt Vivian demanded to see documentation proving the validity of this mysterious second will. My cousins huddled together in urgent whispered consultation, their earlier satisfaction replaced by desperate calculation about how to protect inheritances that suddenly seemed far less secure. Through it all, Alessandro remained perfectly calm, his professional poise unshaken by the family hysteria erupting around him. He simply waited, one hand resting on his briefcase, until the initial wave of outrage and denial had exhausted itself into grudging attention. "Perhaps," he suggested once relative quiet had been restored, "it would be helpful to review the documentation systematically rather than responding to incomplete information." He spread the Swiss will across the table, its elaborate formatting and multiple official seals immediately distinguishing it from the simpler British document Mr. Whitmore had just finished reading. The header identified it as executed through the offices of Benedetti and Partners in Geneva, with witness signatures from Swiss banking officials and notarization that appeared to meet the highest international standards. Theodore Ashford maintained Swiss residency for tax purposes for over 15 years, Alessandro explained, his tone taking on the patient quality of someone accustomed to explaining complex legal arrangements to emotional families. This allowed him to structure significant portions of his wealth through European frameworks that provide both privacy and strategic flexibility. Mr. Whitmore, who had been examining the document with visible distress, finally spoke. "The notification letter. I remember receiving something from a Swiss firm months ago. I assumed it was routine international correspondence related to currency exchanges or investment reporting. I had no idea. His voice trailed off as the magnitude of his oversight became apparent. Through administrative failure, he had missed information that would have completely altered his handling of grandfather's estate and the family's expectations about inheritance distributions. The Swiss assets, Alessandro continued, consulting a separate document that appeared to be a comprehensive financial summary, currently total approximately £47 million, representing Theodore's most significant wealth accumulation through technology investments and international property development. The figure hit the room like a physical blow. £47 million, more than triple the value of the British estate that had just been distributed among my relatives. And apparently, all of it was now mine. "This is impossible," Uncle Charles declared, though his voice lacked the conviction of his earlier protests. Theodore would never have made such arrangements without informing the family. We were his closest relationships, his business partners, his natural heirs. Alessandro's expression suggested he had encountered this reaction before. "I believe Theodore's perspective differed from yours regarding which family relationships were most meaningful to him," he replied diplomatically. The Swiss will includes extensive personal notes explaining his reasoning, notes that make clear his decisions were based on careful observation of family dynamics over many years. He turned toward me with an expression that combined professional duty with what seemed like personal warmth. "Miss Ashford, your grandfather left specific instructions that these arrangements be explained to you privately, given the sensitive nature of some information. Would you be willing to meet at my hotel this evening to review the complete documentation?" Before I could respond, Aunt Vivian interrupted with sharp authority. "Any information relevant to Theodore's estate should be disclosed to all family members. We won't allow private meetings that could influence interpretation of his wishes." "With respect," Alessandro replied, his tone cooling noticeably. "The Swiss will specify precisely who has authority regarding these assets and information. That authority rests solely with Isabella, as the named beneficiary and executor. This revelation, that I had inherited not just wealth but complete control over its management and disclosure, sent another wave of shock through my relatives. They were accustomed to collective family decision-making, where established authorities could influence and ultimately direct individual choices. The possibility that I now possessed independent power beyond their reach or influence represented a fundamental challenge to the Ashford family system. "Isabella," Uncle Charles said, his tone shifting to the persuasive warmth he employed when attempting to redirect family discussions toward his preferred outcomes. "This is overwhelming for everyone, but particularly for you. Perhaps we should all meet together to review these documents and discuss how to proceed in a way that honors Theodore's memory while protecting the family's interests." The familiar appeal to family loyalty and collective decision-making was so automatic that I almost nodded in agreement before catching myself. For the first time in my life, I possessed leverage that couldn't be diminished through emotional manipulation or social pressure. The question was whether I had the courage to exercise that leverage according to my own judgment rather than family expectations. "I think private consultation would be appropriate," I replied, meeting Alessandro's gaze directly. "Given the complexity of what you're describing, I need to understand the full situation before making decisions about information sharing or family involvement." The statement, asserting independent authority over my inheritance rather than automatically deferring to family consensus, created a moment of stunned silence among relatives accustomed to my compliance with collective wisdom. Uncle Charles's expression hardened almost imperceptibly, his business instincts recognizing a negotiating position that wouldn't yield to standard family pressure tactics. For the first time since childhood, I was operating from a position of strength rather than supplication, and everyone in the room was beginning to understand the implications of that fundamental shift in our family dynamics. The Savoy Hotel's elegant cocktail lounge provided the perfect setting for revelations that would complete the transformation of my understanding about both my grandfather and my place in the Ashford family narrative. Alessandro had chosen a private corner table overlooking the Thames, where the evening lights reflected off the dark water in patterns that shifted with the river's movement. "Your grandfather was a remarkable man," Alessandro began once our drinks had been served, his tone shifting from the formal professionalism he had displayed at the law office to something more personal and reflective. Not merely because of his business acumen, though that was considerable, but because of his capacity for growth and self-reflection, even in his final years. He opened a leather portfolio and withdrew several documents, including what appeared to be a handwritten letter on expensive stationery. This contains his personal explanation for the arrangements you've inherited, written specifically for you and never shared with anyone else, including myself until after his death. The letter was dated just 3 months before grandfather's passing, written in the careful script I remembered from birthday cards that had arrived regularly throughout my childhood, despite the family's general dismissal of my achievements. My dear Isabella, if you are reading this letter, then Alessandro has successfully executed the plan I developed over the past 5 years. A plan necessitated by my growing awareness of how thoroughly I misjudged the character and loyalties of those I had previously considered my most trusted family members. The Swiss arrangements began as simple tax optimization, but evolved into something far more significant once I discovered certain disturbing patterns within my own household and business operation. Through discreet investigation, I learned that family members I had enriched and trusted were systematically undermining both my business interests and my personal values. I paused, my heart racing as the implications of grandfather's words began to register. This wasn't merely about alternative estate planning, but about betrayal within the family itself. Charles, whom I groomed as my business successor, has been embezzling from Ashford Holdings for over 3 years, redirecting funds through shell companies he believed I was too old to detect. Vivian has been selling information about my art acquisitions to competitors, allowing them to outbid me on pieces I specifically targeted. Your cousins have established their own investment partnerships using insider information from my business planning sessions. The revelations were staggering. A systematic pattern of theft and betrayal by the very family members who had presented themselves as devoted relatives worthy of inheritance. No wonder grandfather had seemed increasingly isolated in his final years. He had been surrounded by people who saw him primarily as a source of advantage to be exploited. Most painful was discovering that their treatment of you, the casual dismissal, the subtle undermining, the consistent message that your interests and values were somehow inferior to theirs, was not merely misguided family dynamics, but deliberate strategy. They recognized that you alone among my descendants had maintained genuine integrity and independence, making you a potential threat to their schemes. Your refusal to accept financial support that came with strings attached, your insistence on building your own career despite family pressure to join the business, your commitment to causes that serve others rather than merely advancing your own position. These qualities marked you as dangerous to people whose own positions depended on moral compromise. The letter continued with detailed documentation of the family's various betrayals, information that explained Uncle Charles's recent expansion of business operations, and Aunt Vivian's increasingly expensive lifestyle, along with evidence that my cousins had been planning to pressure grandfather into early wealth transfers that would have facilitated their embezzlement schemes. He knew, I murmured, the full scope of grandfather's awareness becoming clear. He knew everything they were doing. Alessandro nodded gravely. Theodore was many things, but naive was never one of them. He allowed their schemes to continue while gathering evidence and making alternative arrangements. Arrangements that would both protect his true wealth and ensure it reached the one family member who could be trusted to use it honorably. As I continued reading, grandfather's letter revealed the true extent of the Swiss holdings, not just the 47 million pounds Alessandro had mentioned, but controlling interests in technology companies developing revolutionary medical devices, real estate investments across European capitals, and most significantly, a private foundation dedicated to social justice causes that had been operating anonymously for over a decade. You've been funding the community programs I work with, I realized, connecting details from the letter to initiatives I had assumed were supported by anonymous benefactors. The literacy programs, the housing assistance, the legal aid clinic, that was you, through grandfather's foundation. Theodore was extraordinarily proud of your work, Alessandro confirmed. He monitored your career closely, often saying that you embodied the values he wished he had prioritized earlier in his own life. The foundation's support for your programs was his way of acknowledging your efforts while maintaining the independence he knew you valued. The revelation created a complex mix of emotions: gratitude for support I hadn't known existed, amazement at grandfather's secretive generosity, and growing anger at the family members who had dismissed my work while benefiting from wealth that was partially built through values they claimed to despise. There's more, Alessandro continued, his expression growing more serious. The investigation that uncovered your family's betrayals also revealed external threats to Ashford interests. The Kozlov Syndicate, a criminal organization operating across Eastern Europe, has been courting Charles and Vivian, offering substantial payments for access to certain Ashford business relationships and government contracts. This escalation from family embezzlement to international criminal conspiracy added dimensions of danger I had never imagined could touch our seemingly conventional wealthy British family. Suddenly, the stakes involved more than money. They encompassed personal safety and national security concerns. Your grandfather believed these external threats would intensify once his protection was removed. Alessandro continued, his voice dropping lower as he glanced around the lounge to ensure our conversation remained private. The Kozlov syndicate doesn't merely seek business advantages. They use corporate relationships to launder money and influence political processes across Western Europe. The scope of what grandfather had discovered was becoming clearer. Not just family betrayal, but a web of criminal activity that threatened far more than Ashford wealth. My relatives' greed had made them vulnerable to manipulation by forces they were too naive or too corrupt to recognize as dangerous. Charles received his first payment from Kozlov representatives 6 months ago, Alessandro revealed, opening another folder containing bank records and surveillance photographs. The money was disguised as consulting fees for a non-existent advisory position, but the real payment was for providing access to government officials Ashford Holdings works with on defense contracts. The implications were staggering. Uncle Charles hadn't merely been stealing from the family business, but had been selling access to sensitive government relationships to international criminals. His inheritance of Ashford Holdings would have given the Kozlov syndicate unprecedented influence within British security and defense circles. That's why grandfather changed everything at the last minute, I realized, pieces falling into place. He wasn't just protecting his wealth, he was protecting national security. Precisely, Alessandro confirmed. Theodore couldn't expose the criminal connections without destroying his own business and potentially endangering family members who might have been innocent of direct involvement. Instead, he chose to transfer control to the one person he trusted to handle the situation appropriately. The weight of this responsibility was overwhelming. I had inherited not just wealth, but the obligation to neutralize threats that extended far beyond family dynamics to international criminal activity. The community organizer, who had been dismissed as naive and idealistic, was now tasked with outmaneuvering sophisticated criminal networks. "What am I supposed to do?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "I have no experience with corporate security or international criminal investigations." "You have something more valuable than experience," Alessandro replied, his tone taking on an unexpected warmth. "You have principles that can't be compromised and judgment that hasn't been corrupted by proximity to power. Theodore believed these qualities would guide you to appropriate solutions." He reached into his briefcase one final time, withdrawing a sealed envelope marked with my name in grandfather's distinctive handwriting. His final letter contains specific recommendations for addressing the immediate threats while protecting both family members and business interests. As I broke the seal and unfolded the letter, Alessandro's phone buzzed with an urgent message. His expression grew tense as he read it quickly. "We may have less time than anticipated," he murmured, showing me the screen. "My associates in Geneva report unusual activity around several accounts connected to your family members. It appears they may be accelerating their timeline for whatever arrangements they've made with the Kozlov syndicate." Grandfather's letter outlined a comprehensive strategy for exposing the criminal connections while protecting innocent employees and community relationships that depended on Ashford Holdings' continued operation. But the plan required careful timing and coordination with law enforcement agencies that had been secretly investigating the Kozlov syndicate for years. "Your grandfather had been cooperating with British intelligence for the past 18 months, Alessandro revealed. "This inheritance isn't just about family justice. It's the culmination of an operation designed to neutralize a significant criminal threat to European security." The revelation transformed my understanding of the entire situation. The dismissive laughter from my relatives earlier that day, their casual assumption that I was worth nothing to grandfather, the shock when Alessandro appeared with evidence of my massive inheritance, all had been orchestrated by a man who had been playing a much more complex and dangerous game than anyone realized. "What happens next?" I asked, gripping the letter that contained instructions for a mission I had never been prepared to undertake. "Next," Alessandro said with a smile that carried both reassurance and anticipation, "we spring the trap your grandfather spent his final years preparing. And your family discovers that the overlooked granddaughter they laughed at today is about to become their judge, jury, and potentially their salvation, if they deserve it." The emergency family meeting convened at my grandfather's estate the following morning. Though the power dynamics had shifted dramatically since Alessandro's revelation, I sat in grandfather's chair at the head of the library table, a position that had always been Uncle Charles's to claim, now mine by inheritance and necessity. The portfolio of evidence Alessandro had provided lay closed before me, its contents representing the nuclear option in what had become a family crisis with international implications. My relatives filed in with subdued expressions that contrasted sharply with their triumphant mood from the previous day. Uncle Charles maintained his authoritative bearing, but with visible strain around his eyes. Aunt Vivian had abandoned her usual jewelry display, perhaps recognizing that ostentation was inappropriate given the financial crimes about to be exposed. My cousins flanked their parents with the careful positioning of people preparing for battle rather than family discussion. Alessandro briefed me thoroughly last night, I began, my voice steadier than I had expected given the magnitude of what I was about to reveal. Grandfather's Swiss will wasn't merely about alternative asset distribution. It was about protecting Ashford Holdings and our family from criminal infiltration that had already begun. Uncle Charles straightened defensively. If you're suggesting some kind of impropriety, I'm not suggesting anything, I interrupted, opening the portfolio to reveal bank records documenting his payments from Kozlov front companies. I'm presenting evidence that grandfather compiled over 18 months of investigation. The financial documentation spread across the table told an undeniable story. Systematic theft from Ashford Holdings disguised as legitimate business expenses, unauthorized access to government contract information, and most damning, regular payments from entities ultimately controlled by the Kozlov syndicate. Aunt Vivian was staring at photographs showing her meeting with art dealers who had later been identified as money laundering specialists. "This is entrapment," she whispered, her usual commanding voice reduced to desperate denial. "Theodore set us up. Theodore documented criminal activity," I corrected. "The choice to engage in that activity was yours." Alessandro entered the library at that moment, having arrived precisely on schedule to provide professional support for the confrontation I had dreaded, but knew was necessary. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere. This was no longer merely a family dispute, but a legal proceeding with international implications. "British intelligence has been monitoring the Kozlov syndicate for 3 years, he announced without preamble. "Your cooperation over the past months has provided essential evidence for a coordinated operation that will neutralize their British networks today." The statement hit the room like a bomb. My family members had been unknowing assets in a larger intelligence operation, their greed and criminal activity serving to expose and ultimately destroy the very organization they had been serving. "What does this mean for us?" Richard asked, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "That depends on your willingness to cooperate with ongoing investigations," Alessandro replied matter-of-factly. "The evidence of your criminal activity is comprehensive and irrefutable. However, your value as witnesses against higher-level Kozlov operations could influence how aggressively these crimes are prosecuted." Uncle Charles had gone very pale, the implications of potential prison sentences clearly registering. "What about the family business? If this becomes public, Ashford Holdings will be protected," I said, speaking for the first time with the authority of ownership rather than family membership. "The Swiss assets provide sufficient resources to maintain operations and protect innocent employees, while legal proceedings unfold. This assurance that their criminal activity wouldn't destroy the business or the livelihoods it supported represented the compassionate approach grandfather had built into his complex plan. Justice for their betrayals balanced against protection for those who depended on family enterprises that predated and would outlast this particular crisis. "You're offering immunity in exchange for cooperation?" Aunt Vivian asked, hope beginning to compete with desperation in her expression. "I'm offering the opportunity for redemption through truth-telling and restitution," I corrected. "Whether that leads to immunity depends on the extent of your cooperation and the accuracy of your revelations about Kozlov operations." The proposal provided a path forward that honored both justice and mercy, qualities grandfather had apparently recognized in me when choosing his unlikely heir. The family members who had laughed at my exclusion from conventional inheritance were now dependent on my judgment for their freedom and futures. The sting operation unfolded with cinematic precision over the following week. Alessandro's colleagues had coordinated with British intelligence to create a scenario where my criminal family members would expose the full extent of Kozlov syndicate operations while believing they were negotiating for more lenient treatment of their own crimes. Uncle Charles was convinced to attend a final meeting with his Kozlov handlers, ostensibly to transfer additional government contract information in exchange for safe passage out of Britain before arrests began. What he didn't know was that British agents had replaced the actual criminals, recording every detail of the transfer protocols and payment structures that had been operating within our family business. Aunt Vivian was similarly manipulated into revealing the art market money laundering scheme, providing evidence that connected the Kozlov operations to tax evasion and fraud networks across the European Union. Her cooperation, motivated by promises of reduced sentences, gave investigators access to financial records spanning years of criminal collaboration. My cousins, faced with evidence of their complicity and the prospect of serious prison time, had chosen full cooperation from the beginning. Their insider knowledge of Ashford Holdings' business relationships provided the final pieces investigators needed to understand how deeply the Kozlov syndicate had infiltrated British commercial and political circles. "Your family's information has been invaluable," Alessandro reported as we reviewed the operation's progress from the secure conference room British intelligence had established at the Ashford Holdings headquarters. "The arrests made across Europe this week have effectively dismantled the syndicate's British operations and significantly damaged their broader network. The success of the operation had vindicated grandfather's elaborate planning, but its personal cost was enormous. My relatives faced criminal prosecution despite their cooperation, their reputations destroyed along with their prospects for the comfortable futures they had planned. The family business would survive and ultimately thrive under my stewardship, but the Ashford family itself had been fundamentally fractured by revelations of betrayal and criminality. What becomes of them now?" I asked, thinking of Uncle Charles and Aunt Vivian awaiting sentencing in circumstances that would have been unimaginable just weeks earlier. "Reduced sentences in exchange for continued cooperation," Alessandro replied. "Restitution of stolen funds where possible. Permanent exclusion from any involvement in family business operations." He paused, studying my expression carefully. "Your grandfather left those decisions ultimately to your discretion, recognizing that justice and mercy must be balanced according to principles he couldn't fully predict or prescribe. This final responsibility, determining how harshly to pursue justice against family members whose crimes had endangered far more than just Ashford wealth, represented the most challenging aspect of my unexpected inheritance. The power to forgive or condemn carried moral weight that financial assets couldn't match. There's something else you should know," Alessandro continued, his expression growing more personal than professional. "Your grandfather's cooperation with intelligence services wasn't motivated solely by patriotic duty or business protection. He was particularly concerned about how Kozlov operations might affect the community programs you've devoted your career to supporting. This revelation connected my grandfather's secret activism to my own social justice work in ways I had never imagined possible. The foundation he had established through Swiss Holdings had been funding legal aid and housing assistance programs that directly countered criminal activities the Kozlov syndicate was using to exploit vulnerable populations. He saw your work as the practical application of values he had abandoned in pursuit of wealth and status," Alessandro explained. "The inheritance he designed wasn't just about transferring assets, but about creating opportunities for those values to operate on a scale that could generate systemic change rather than merely individual assistance." As we concluded our meeting, and I prepared to assume full control of the Ashford Empire, I reflected on the extraordinary week that had transformed me from ignored family member to the architect of justice for crimes I had never known existed. The second lawyer's appearance with hidden documents had initiated a cascade of revelations that reached far beyond family inheritance to encompass international criminal conspiracy and, ultimately, personal redemption. The laughter that had greeted my apparent exclusion from grandfather's will now seemed prophetic rather than cruel. The last moment when my family could afford to dismiss someone they had consistently underestimated and would never be able to underestimate again. The final confrontation took place exactly where it had all begun, in the library of the Ashford estate, with rain once again lashing the windows and thunder providing dramatic punctuation to revelations that would conclude the most extraordinary chapter in our family's 3-century history. But this time, I sat in grandfather's chair while my former tormentors occupied the peripheral seats they had once assigned to me. Uncle Charles and Aunt Vivian had been released on bail pending their cooperation with ongoing international investigations, their movements monitored, and their assets frozen pending restitution calculations. They sat with the rigid posture of people whose world had collapsed, but who were still processing the extent of their downfall. My cousins flanked them, their earlier arrogance replaced by the hollow-eyed awareness of futures that would forever be defined by their parents' criminal choices. "The intelligence operation has concluded successfully," Alessandro announced to the assembled group, his professional tone acknowledging both achievement and tragedy. "The Kozlov syndicate's British networks have been neutralized, with arrests continuing across Europe as evidence gathered through your cooperation enables broader action." He placed a thick folder on the table, the complete documentation of crimes committed by my family members, evidence that would determine their legal fate in proceedings scheduled over the coming months. "Your sentences will reflect the extent of your cooperation and the value of information provided," he continued. "Charles, Your testimony regarding Kozlov infiltration of government contracting processes has been particularly valuable. Vivian, your evidence about art market money laundering has opened investigations in 6 countries. This acknowledgement of their criminal utility provided cold comfort at best. Their betrayals of family and country had made them valuable to law enforcement, but couldn't restore the trust and relationships their actions had destroyed. What I don't understand, Uncle Charles said, his voice carrying a mixture of defeat and lingering bewilderment, is how Theodore planned all this. The coordination with intelligence services, the alternative will, the careful positioning of Isabella, it suggests planning that extended back years. Alessandro's smile held no warmth as he consulted his documentation. Theodore began suspecting problems 4 years ago when audit irregularities suggested internal theft. Rather than confronting family members directly, he chose to investigate thoroughly while appearing increasingly frail and inattentive, a performance that encouraged your criminal activities to expand while he documented everything. The revelation of grandfather's strategic deception was perhaps more shocking than the criminal exposures. The man we had assumed was declining into elderly confusion had actually been orchestrating an elaborate counterintelligence operation that would protect his legacy while delivering justice for years of betrayal. He sacrificed his relationship with us, Aunt Vivian whispered, tears beginning to flow as the emotional dimensions of what had occurred finally registered. He spent his final years alone, letting us believe he was losing his faculties while actually conducting surveillance on his own family. He sacrificed nothing, I said, speaking with authority that surprised even me. You sacrificed your relationship with him through your choices to steal, betray, and ultimately endanger everything he had built. His investigation was a response to your actions, not the cause of them. This assignment of responsibility where it belonged, with those who had chosen criminal activity rather than those who had uncovered it, represented a clarity of moral judgment that grandfather had apparently recognized and trusted when selecting his ultimate heir. The immediate question, Alessandro interjected, returning focus to practical matters, is how to structure Ashford Holdings' governance going forward. Isabella has inherited control during a period when significant criminal prosecutions will generate substantial media attention and potential market instability. The challenge he outlined was daunting, managing a complex business empire while navigating public scrutiny of my family's criminal activity, maintaining stakeholder confidence despite the dramatic change in leadership, and ensuring that legitimate business interests weren't damaged by association with the criminal elements that had been excised. I'll need significant support, I acknowledged, my honesty about limitations apparently appreciated by Alessandro, based on his approving nod. But I believe grandfather chose me not because I was the most qualified by conventional measures, but because I was the most trustworthy to prioritize company values over personal advantage. This assessment aligned with themes from grandfather's letter, his conviction that integrity and independence were more valuable than experience and credentials, when facing corruption that had infiltrated the very foundations of family and business relationships. As the meeting concluded with arrangements for ongoing cooperation with legal proceedings and transition planning for my assumption of full corporate control, Uncle Charles made one final appeal. Isabella, he said, his voice stripped of its usual authority, regardless of what happens to us legally, please remember that Ashford Holdings represents more than just our family. Thousands of employees, millions in pension obligations, community relationships built over generations, they don't deserve to suffer for our mistakes. The plea acknowledged what I had already recognized, that justice for family betrayals must be balanced against protection for innocent parties whose lives and livelihoods depended on decisions I would make as the new head of the Ashford Empire. The company will be protected, I assured him, meaning it. Grandfather didn't orchestrate this elaborate plan just to see his life's work destroyed. He believed I could preserve what was valuable while eliminating what had become corrupt. As my disgraced relatives departed under escort to continue their cooperation with ongoing investigations, I remained in the library where this extraordinary week had begun. The second lawyer's entrance with hidden documents had triggered revelations that extended far beyond family inheritance to encompass international crime, intelligence operations, and ultimately, personal transformation that no one, least of all myself, could have anticipated. 2 years later, I stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office in the newly renovated Ashford Holdings headquarters, watching London's evening lights begin to twinkle as another productive day concluded. The view from the top floor encompassed not just the financial district where our company had established its reputation over generations, but the neighborhoods where grandfather's anonymous foundation, now operating openly under my direction, had expanded its community development programs. The transformation of both the business and my role within it had exceeded even grandfather's optimistic projections. Ashford Holdings had not only survived the criminal prosecutions and media scrutiny surrounding my family's downfall, but had emerged with enhanced reputation for ethical governance and social responsibility. The intelligence cooperation that had exposed the Kozlov syndicate had positioned us as a trusted partner to government agencies and international organizations seeking reliable corporate allies in ongoing security matters. Uncle Charles had received a reduced sentence of 3 years in minimum security prison, with early parole possible based on his continued cooperation with investigators pursuing remnants of the criminal network. Aunt Vivian faced similar terms, though her involvement in money laundering carried additional complications that might extend her incarceration. My cousins had avoided prison entirely through plea agreements that required substantial restitution and permanent exclusion from any connection to family business operations. The board unanimously approved the expansion into renewable energy sectors, reported Jennifer Walsh, the chief strategy officer I had recruited from a rival firm specifically for her expertise in sustainable business development. Your grandfather's technology investments have positioned us perfectly for the market shifts toward environmental responsibility. This evolution of Ashford Holdings from traditional manufacturing toward innovation-driven sustainability represented my most significant strategic contribution, applying the social justice values that had defined my pre-inheritance career to corporate decision-making in ways that generated both profit and positive impact. The approach had attracted new investors, talented employees, and government contracts that more than compensated for any business lost through our refusal to engage in the morally questionable practices that had characterized previous operations. Most importantly, the company now operated according to transparency and accountability standards that would prevent the kind of criminal infiltration my family's greed had enabled. Regular ethics audits, whistleblower protections, and external oversight mechanisms ensured that employee concerns about illegal or unethical activities would be addressed immediately, rather than ignored or suppressed. The Foundation's annual report is ready for your review, added Marcus Thornton, the former community organizer I had hired to direct the Ashford Foundation's expanded operations. The housing initiative has provided assistance to over 300 families this year, while the legal aid clinic has handled nearly 2,000 cases. These programs represented the practical application of wealth toward addressing systemic problems rather than merely providing charity that maintained existing inequities. Grandfather's secret foundation had operated this way for years. Bringing it into the open had allowed expansion and coordination with other organizations pursuing similar goals. As my staff departed for their evening commitments, I remained at the window contemplating the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this position. The family laughter that had greeted my apparent exclusion from grandfather's will seemed like events from another lifetime, though barely 2 years had passed since that stormy afternoon when everything had changed. The second lawyer's entrance with hidden documents had revealed not just alternative financial arrangements, but a grandfather whose apparent detachment had concealed profound engagement with both family dynamics and broader social responsibilities. His carefully orchestrated inheritance plan had simultaneously delivered justice for family betrayals, neutralized international criminal threats, and created opportunities for values-based leadership that extended far beyond conventional business metrics. Alessandro had returned to Geneva but maintained regular contact as my advisor on international aspects of both business operations and foundation activities. Our professional relationship had evolved into something more personal. Not romance, exactly, but mutual respect and growing affection based on shared commitment to using wealth responsibly, rather than merely accumulating it. Your grandfather would be pleased, he had observed during his most recent visit, not just with the company's performance or the foundation's impact, but with how you've grown into leadership while maintaining the integrity that made you worthy of his trust. The assessment felt accurate. I had indeed grown into the role through necessity and opportunity, but without losing the values and perspectives that had made me different from family members who had pursued wealth and status through compromise and ultimately criminality. The original Ashford estate had been converted into a conference center and retreat facility for the Foundation's programs, its elegant rooms now hosting workshops on community organizing, leadership development, and social justice advocacy. The library where grandfather's will had been read now served as a research center, where community activists could access resources and strategic support for their efforts to address systemic inequities. Victoria's fate remained unknown. Intelligence reports suggested she had disappeared into the Russian protection network that had recruited her. Her beauty and capabilities, presumably still valuable to criminal organizations, despite the failure of her British operations. Whether she had found the recognition and power she had craved through these associations, or whether she had simply traded one form of manipulation for another, would likely never be known. Standing in the office that had become both symbol and instrument of my transformation from overlooked family member to leader of institutions that employed thousands and served tens of thousands more, I reflected on grandfather's extraordinary gamble. He had bet everything on the character of a granddaughter the family had consistently dismissed, trusting that qualities they had undervalued would prove essential when facing challenges they couldn't have imagined. The hidden document Alessandro had revealed that day hadn't merely transferred wealth. It had initiated a cascade of justice, transformation, and ultimately hope that extended far beyond the Ashford family to encompass communities and causes that embodied the values grandfather had recognized in me when no one else, including myself, had seen them clearly. The laughter had indeed been premature, as the most profound inheritances often go to those who never expected them and prove worthy precisely because they never sought them for selfish reasons. If you enjoyed this story of family betrayal, hidden fortunes, and ultimate justice, please subscribe to my channel for more tales that explore the dangerous intersections of love, money, and revenge. In my next video, we'll uncover another story where appearances deceive and the most overlooked person holds the power to change everything. Until then, remember that in families built on secrets, the truth always finds a way to surface, often when those who deserve it least expect it most.